Bees, wasps, insects, and the biosphere. Bees. Bees have an impressive diversity of size, form, and nesting behavior. They can be found in high alpine and subarctic regions, rainforests, savannas, steppes, and deserts. The vast majority of species, more than 90%, are solitary or non-social. Here, each nest is the work of a single female working alone. Worldwide, bees pollinate more than 400 crops. Most of the managed pollination is by honeybees. Honeybees are under increasing pressure from disease, parasites, and colony collapse disorder. Bees are remarkable in that they cover the whole spectrum of sociality, displaying a wide range of different types of social behavior and organization. Some species are solitary. Some live together in communal groups. Others live in complex societies where individuals are almost completely subservient to the needs of the social group, even giving up their own ability to reproduce in the interest of the hive. Epochs of animal evolution. There are 6 to 10 million insect species. The oldest insect fossil is from about 400 million years ago, during the Devonian period. There are about 16 to 20,000 different species of bees. The earliest bee fossil is from about 100 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period. In contrast, there are only about 5,450 species of mammals. Mammals first appear in the fossil record 167 million years ago, during the Jurassic period. What are bees? Bees are hunting wasps, which have become vegetarians. Both wasps and bees have sucking mouth parts to feed on nectar. Many bees have evolved long tongues for feeding on and gathering nectar from deep tube flowers, and almost all have evolved complex structures for the gathering, transport, and handling of pollen. Some bee species also use other plant products, such as oils as larval food and leaves, cotton wool, resin, to be used in nest construction. Baby bee metamorphosis. Bees go through a complete metamorphosis. That is, the egg hatches into a larva, a feeding stage, which molts its skin several times as it increases in size. In the next developmental step, the prepupa of some species spin a silk cocoon. In the next stage of the pupa, there is no feeding and little or no movement. Instead, within the pupal skin, one of the most remarkable transformations in nature takes place. The larval tissues break down and reassemble into adult form. At first, the pupa is pale and the cuticle is soft. The wings and legs are unexpanded, and the eyes are also pale. Eventually, the eyes become black, heralding the subsequent gradual darkening and hardening of the cuticle. The membranous wings begin to expand as blood is pumped through the network of veins and body hairs become apparent. Honeybees. The honeybee is one of nature's master pollinators. The majority of flowering plants need animals to pollinate them, and the honeybee is perfectly engineered to perform the task, with a body designed to trap pollen and a work ethic that leaves no petal unturned. Approximately 1/3 of the average diet, or to put it another way, 1 in 3 mouthfuls that the average person eats, has been pollinated by honeybees. Some 90 commercial crops worldwide owe their continued existence to the honeybee. If the honeybee vanished off the face of the earth, no country would be able to solve food shortages. Bees have a sophisticated navigation system that uses the sun and landmarks as points of reference. It allows them to travel up to 5 kilometers from the hive without losing their way back home. They are able to direct other bees to food supplies through a form of communication called the waggle dance. Honeybees communicate with high-frequency buzzes and complex systems of pheromonal communication. Winter survival. In cold climates, honeybees stop flying when the temperature drops below about 10 degrees Celsius. and the crowd into the central area of the hive to form a winter cluster. The worker bees huddle around the queen bee at the center of the cluster, shivering to keep the center between 27 at the start of winter during the broodless period and 34 degrees Celsius once the queen resumes laying. The worker bees rotate through the cluster from the outside to the inside so that no bee gets too cold. The outside edges of the cluster stay at about 8 to 9 degrees Celsius. The colder the weather is outside, the more compact the cluster becomes. During winter, they consume their stored honey to produce body heat. The amount of honey consumed during the winter is a function of winter length and severity, but ranges in temperature climates from 15 to 50 kilograms. In addition, certain bees, including the western honeybee as well as Apis carana, are known to engage in effective methods of nest thermal regulation during periods of varying temperature in both summer and winter. During summer, this is achieved through fanning and water evaporation from water collected in various fields. A world without honeybees. Removing honeybees would break the link that begins with flowering plants. Without the flowers being pollinated, there would be far fewer seeds, roots, leaves, flowers, or fruits for birds and small mammals to eat, and they would die. As a result, the predators, the omnivores or carnivores that continue the chain, would starve. Bumblebees. Bumblebees are adept at pollinating tomatoes, potatoes, and artichokes. Some Northern American male bumblebees incubate brood. Some Southern American male bumblebee species secrete wax and use it to build honey storage pods and brood cells. Bumblebee behavior. In spring, a solitary mated female comes out of hibernation and searches for a safe place to rear her brood, often in a tussock of dead grass or an abandoned mouse burrow. In this snug den, she builds a little wax cup, or honey pot, and fills it with floral nectar as a larder to help sustain her during her labor. She gathers and shapes a large ball of pollen, lays her eggs, 4 to 16 in a batch, and covers the whole thing with wax. She lies on top of the ball and incubates by shivering her large flight muscles, thereby generating enough heat to keep the eggs at a cozy 29 degrees Celsius. 4 or 5 weeks later, the offspring, all females, emerge as adults and set to work foraging and helping around the nest. Thereafter, the fertilized mother bee, or queen, devotes herself to egg laying, while her unfertilized daughters, the workers, help to rear successive broods of her sisters. At its height, a successful bumblebee colony will number between 30 and 400 female members. The males, or drones, have only one interest in life and are produced in late summer just in time to mate with fresh young queens for the following year. Defense and aggression. When they reach 2 to 3 weeks of age, worker bees engage in environmental regulation with regard to temperature and protecting the entrance of the hive from intruders. Only related bees are allowed into the hive. Coordinated group behavior can warn off predators by looking larger than any individual bee could. Honeybees regulate defensive behavior by using alarm pheromones. Guard bees comprise 1 to 2% of the colony. Some hover near the nest while others stand on the wax nest entrance. There are 20 to 40 guard bees at or near the entrance at any one time. The guards have longer hind legs and are 30% heavier than a foraging worker. The guards aggressively defend the nest against any intruder, grabbing and clamping attackers with their jaws. Invasions can result in colony death, and grabbing a scout bee may prevent a potential invasion or give the colony time to mount their defenses. Robbing behavior is especially strong when there is little nectar in the field. Strong colonies with the largest stores are most apt to prey upon weaker colonies. Some robbing is carried out so secretly that it escapes notice. Most of the time, when robbing is going on, one can see bees from the opposing hives fight. The fights can lead to significant losses of bees. Robbing may go on between hives in one apiary or hives of different apiaries. The western honeybee has been identified with an especially strong tendency to rob. Carpenter bees. The bee genus Caratina, often referred to as small carpenter bees, is the sole lineage of the tribe Caratinini and closely related to more familiar carpenter bees. They make nests in dead wood, stems, or pith, and while many are solitary, our number are subsocial, with mothers caring for their larvae, and in a few cases where multiple females are found in a single nest, daughters or sisters may form very small, weakly eusocial colonies, where one bee forages and the other remains in the nest and lays eggs. One species is unique for having both social and asocial populations, Caratina australensis, which exhibits all of the pre-adaptations for successful group living. This species is socially polymorphic, with both solitary and social nests collecting in sympatry. In biology, two related species or populations are considered sympatric when they exist in the same geographic area and thus frequently encounter one another. An initially interbreeding population that splits into two or more distinct species sharing a common range exemplifies sympatric speciation. Social colonies in that species consist of two foundresses, one contributing both foraging and reproductive effort, and the second which remains at the nest as a passive guard. Cooperative nesting provides no overt reproductive benefits over solitary nesting in this population, although brood survival tends to be greater in social colonies. The mason bee. Other common names of the mason bee are blue orchard bee or orchard mason bee. They're approximately 9 to 11 millimeters long. These are stocky bees with a round, broad head, robust jaws, and round, wide abdomens. Their bodies are metallic dark blue with long whitish hairs, while their eyes, legs, and antennae are black. Females carry pollen on specialized hairs beneath the abdomen, a common feature among bees in this family. Their diet is of nectar and pollen. These bees are important fruit tree pollinators. Behavior. These are solitary nesting bees that are especially active in early spring. They nest alone in long, narrow spaces like hollow plant stems. They lay several eggs, each in its own chamber, with walls made from mud or chewed leaves. The giant mason bee. The longest bee, which is 39 millimeters long and a wingspan of 63 millimeters, is Megachiel pluto, or the giant mason bee, which live in the Malay archipelago. This bee burrows in the sides of active nests of termites. The female giant mason bee uses her massive jaws to create resin flows by wounding trees. The bee then makes a ball of resin, which she flies to her nest. She lines her brood cell with the resin as a protection from termites. Pollination. Bees, plants, and pollination. Some plants spread pollen via wind. Their flowers are small and inconspicuous. For most plants, only pollen grains from a different individual of the same species will germinate and ultimately fertilize the flower. This is an adaptation to avoid interbreeding, an incest taboo, mediated by an incompatibility system built into the chemistry of the stigmatic surface. Pollen from the same plant will simply not germinate. This system depends on bees bringing pollen from other individuals of the same species, a process called self-pollination. Cross-pollination maintains genetic diversity. This is the medium through which natural selection favors beneficial traits and ultimately weeds out traits that are deleterious or suboptimal. Breeds have been pollinating flowering plants for over the past 65 million years. There are many pollinators of flowering plants: butterflies, beetles, birds, bats, flies, and several others. Bees, however, are the most efficient pollinators. Bees gather pollen because it is the protein in their diet. Without pollen, no young bees could be raised and the colony would die. Bees use protein-rich pollen to feed baby bees. Nurse bees consume pollen in order to produce brood food. The many different relationships between bees and flowering plants are examples of mutualism, a situation where two or more organisms perform services to the benefit of all concerned. Well-known examples are cleaner fish, which swim in and out of the jaws of sharks with impunity while eating food remains snagged on sharks' teeth. Oxpecker birds walk along the backs of large animals on the African savannas, feeding on ticks and flies. The bee-plant mutualism is much more complex and ecologically important. Bees play a keystone role in the creation and maintenance of habitats that support a myriad of other species, including our own. Solitary bees. There are more than 20,000 or so bee species, mostly solitary bees which do not live in bee communities. There are 4,500 wild, solitary bee species in North America. These bees live alone in holes in the ground, wood, soft mortar, or hollows of reeds and cane. They have neither hives nor honeycomb. The solitary alfalfa leafcutter bee pollinates the alfalfa plant while cutting its leaves into pieces to make nests for its young. The solitary blue orchard bee can fly in cooler weather than honeybees and is an excellent pollinator for many kinds of fruit trees. It visits more flowers per minute than a honeybee and more trees in a day of foraging. Despite significant variation in biology between solitary bee species, there are a number of basic similarities. They are all relatively short-lived, and their lifestyle is based on the newly hatched males emerging from the nest before the females. For example, the hairy-footed flower bee, also known as the plume-legged bee, digs a hole in clay or mud as a nesting activity, within which she lays her eggs, with female eggs at the bottom and male eggs at the top. This prevents the females from emerging until all the males have done so. The mating season occurs as soon as the females emerge and access males from nearby nests, and the cycle repeats. Subsocial. Orchid bees advance solitary living one step further, with individual queens working together. These Costa Rican bees take over old nests and of others, and by not building a nest from scratch, have an advantage over competitors, because they can rear more offspring. In other species, cooperative breeding systems involve adults providing significant care to young that are not their own genetic offspring. The semi-social pathway. The semi-social pathway has a communal breeding intermediate step. Here, solitary nests are grouped or aggregated close together, sharing nest building and defense, while all females reproduce. Dominance hierarchies eventually develop, with one female taking an unequal share of reproduction and other females losing reproductive opportunities. An overlap of generations forms with young females becoming servants to older dominant females. Nest guarding evolves from a solitary female to involving offspring that stay behind to protect the nest. Eusocial. Eusocial animals live in highly complex groups in which generations overlap. They have a division of labor between worker and reproductive castes and cooperative care of the brood. These true societies have a reproductively dominant queen, and she lays eggs that are reared by individuals other than her mother. In honeybees, adult behavior is determined by age in a process called temporal polytheism. Age polytheism, or temporal polytheism, describes the process of task allocation over time. Nest helpers graduate to guarding outside the nest, then into foraging. Generations of cooperation, which started with acts that were simultaneously beneficial to both individuals, become more complex and formed into reciprocal altruism when the benefit to one of the parties is delayed and the favor is returned later. For example, a bee could lead another bee to a flower with a subsequent return on this investment when the second bee later does the same. This leads to sociality. Superorganism theory. E.O. Wilson and Bert Haldobler have proposed that superorganism is made up of many small organisms analogous to cells working together to form a single body, with worker bees as cells, the queen as the reproductive organs, and the scout and guard bees as the skin. Insect colonies, especially bee colonies, may be considered superorganisms. In the case of honeybees swarming, this can be likened to a superorganism giving birth. Threats to bees. Many of our wild bee fauna are under threat from a variety of human activities, including increased urbanization and the over-fragmentation of natural habitats, not to mention the reduced floral diversity associated with intensive agriculture. In the tropics, vast tracts of rainforest are being lost by logging and the ever-expanding palm oil industry. Wild bees are threatened by overzealous weed control, which has resulted in the loss of habitat and forage for the native pollinators. Monoculture and the removal of hedgerows and field margins has robbed native pollinators of somewhere to rest and nest, while the elimination of pastures have contributed to a dearth of food. Bee losses. Many of the world's wild bee species have been in decline over the last 60 years, and particularly over the last 15 years. An inverse relationship exists between temperature and the size of bees, with higher temperatures resulting in smaller bees. If bees become smaller through climate change, then, given that bigger insects carry more pollen and are able to forage over greater distances, the delicate balance between pollinator and plant could easily change. Effect of agriculture on bees. Land use changes are harmful to bees when habitats that were once suitable for them are lost or damaged. Once commonplace species have now become regionally extinct, and they may only exist at low levels elsewhere. Wetlands, grasslands, and forests are continually being converted to farmland. Urban sprawl decreases biodiversity as it encroaches on rural habitats and degraded through agricultural intensification. Isolated habitat fragments are less likely to retain their native insect populations. Abundance and diversity of bees and other pollinators is often far lower on a crop than on the surrounding vegetation. There has been a shift from traditional hay meadows and clover-rich pastures to chemically fertilized grass-rich fields that support a higher density of livestock, but a much lower density of bees. Farmers have planted extensive monocultures, placing heavy reliance on fertilizers and agrochemicals. Fields have increased in size, making farming more efficient and productive, but the cost is measured in the loss of wetlands, woodlands, and meadows. Hedgerows have been replaced with wire fencing, and field margins have become smaller as more land is plowed. The mowing process destroys new established nests, killing some queens and forcing others to start again. Even when they are pollinated by bees, the fields provided forage only for a short period, and once the crop has been plowed, they offer nothing for the bees. Agrochemicals, such as organophosphates, were very damaging to bee populations. In the mid 1990s, a new class of insecticide was introduced. These were the neonicotinoids. Laboratory bees fed syrup laced with insecticide have been shown to have shortened lives and impaired memory, homing, and foraging behavior. Most convincingly, a study on bumblebees showed when bees were fed with doses of imidacloprid, the dosed colonies were slightly smaller than controlled colonies that had not been given any of the chemical. Crucially, the imidacloprid fed colonies produced only a fraction of the new males and queens necessary to ensure colonies the following year. Some fungicides significantly increased the toxicity of an insecticide. Lambda cihalothryn. Pests and diseases. Humans have helped to spread the western honeybee far and wide across the world, taking with it pests and diseases such as American foulbrood, and en route it has collected new afflictions, including the voramite and the nosema, which is a genus of microsporidian parasites. Most parasite insects and other arthropods, and the best known nosema species, parasitize honeybees, where they are considered a significant disease by beekeepers, often causing a colony to fail to thrive in the spring as they come out of their overwintering period. Insects. There are 900,000 to 1 million insect species. There are at least 1 quintillion insects, equal to about 2.7 billion tons, which is 10 times the biomass of humans. The ecological services of insects support and maintain habitats and ecosystems. They do this via complex webs of interactions between themselves, plants, and other organisms. These webs form a dynamic, self-sustaining safety net on which we depend, and bees occupy keystone positions here. Ecosystem regulation. The roles that insects play in nature are critical to the functioning of every ecosystem they reside in. Humans benefit from insects pollinating flowering plants, decomposing dead plant and animal matter, regulating the populations of an array of organisms, serving as a food source for many organisms, including humans, and even providing medicinal uses through their activities. Insects as pollinators. Insects have an intimate relationship with flowering plants. That is to say, insects and plants have co-evolved, and this is evident in a number of adaptations. Among them is the dependence of most flowering plants on insects for pollination. More than 90% of all flowering plants depend on insects for pollination. The majority of food production for the world depends on insect pollination. Flowering plants make up a large portion of nearly every ecosystem on the planet, and they are essential to the health and stability of each. If plants stumble, then so do ecosystems. Decomposition. Insects' role in the decomposition processes of plants, animals, and other organic life is one of their most important contributions to ecosystem functioning. Once organisms die or begin to decay, their remains must be broken down into smaller parts or elements so that complex organic molecules will be fragmented. Insect feeding activity increases the surface area of dead material so that decomposition proceeds more rapidly by abiotic and biotic influences. Nutrient cycling. Insects help release or liberate elements or molecules back into the ecosystem for use by other organisms. Animals, fungi, bacteria, and other plants do not break down dead organic matter into tiny bits as efficiently and quickly as insects. If not for insects, dead organic matter would accumulate and form a resource for disease-causing organisms. Beetles and flies decompose excrement and by doing so liberate nitrogen, an element critical for a wide range of organisms, but particularly for phototrophic producers into soil and water. An estimated 1 million species or more are represented by, it is estimated, 2 to 10 quintillion insects residing on Earth. Insects are marvelous in the perfection of the evolutionary adaptations that have made them the dominant animal group on the Earth. Insects have adapted for direct sperm transmittal through insemination, thereby relinquishing forever dependence on water for spawning. As a consequence of acquisition of an exoskeleton, they have attained quickness of motion, resistance to desiccation, and the capacity of achieve dominance on land. Although they are primarily consumers of plants, they also pollinate them, thereby providing a secure future both for themselves and for their plant partners. By nearly any measure, members of the class Insecta hold no rivals, especially when the standard focuses on species abundance, efficiency, or contributions to ecosystem functioning. Insects have an evolutionary answer to almost any challenge posed to them. Insects can powerfully shape human existence through destructive interactions. Insects spread disease, eat crops and stored food, maim and kill livestock and pets. In reality, only about 2% of extant insects are actually responsible for destructive effects. The remaining 98% can be classified as either neutral or beneficial to humans. In fact, our very survival as a species depends on insects by pollination, honey, and decomposition. An ecosystem has many components, living and non-living, responsible for keeping populations in check or in balance. However, environmental features are not static and show tremendous variation. In the case of insect pollination populations, most are maintained at non-pest levels from a human perspective by other organisms, including insects that function as predators and parasites. Approximately 25% of all insect species are considered predators, with the majority consuming other insect species. Predators suppress insect populations by 10 to 25%, which maintains the delicate balance between keeping insects in check and a population explosion. Scramble competition. In ecology, scramble competition, or complete symmetric competition, refers to a situation in which a resource is accessible to all competitors. That is, it is not monopolizable by an individual or group. However, since the particular resource is usually finite, scramble competition may lead to decreased survival rates for all competitors if the resource is used to its carrying capacity. Scramble competition is also defined as a finite resource, that is, shared equally amongst the competitors so that the quantity of food per individual declines with increasing population density. A further description of scramble competition is competition for a resource that is inadequate for the needs of all, but which is partitioned equally among contestants so that no competitor obtains the amount it needs, and all would die in extreme cases. Here's another definition of scramble competition. Scramble competition refers to a form of ecological competition wherein a number of species compete for a resource that is in limited supply. which in turn lowers the survival chances of all the competing species. Since there is no limit placed on the exploitation of the resource, it may be used up aggressively by all the species that have free access to it. This, in turn, might cause most or even all species in need of the resource to go without enough of it to sustain themselves. Scramble competition can lead to mass extinction even when the competition for a resource is limited exclusively to the members of only particular species. Wasps. There are about 100,000 wasp species. The earliest wasp fossils are from the Triassic period, 240 million years ago. The most commonly known wasps, such as yellow jackets and hornets, are in the family Vespidae and are eusocial, living together in a nest with an egg-laying queen and non-reproducing workers. Eusociality is favored by the unusual haploidy. Haploidy is a sex determination system in which males develop from unfertilized eggs and are haploid, and females develop from fertilized eggs and are diploid. Haplodiploidy is sometimes called arnicotochy, as a sex determination system in which males develop from unfertilized eggs and are haploid, and females develop from fertilized eggs and are diploid. Haploidy is a system of sex determination in Hymenoptera. Hymenoptera is a large order of insects comprising sawflies, wasps, bees, and ants. Over 150,000 living species of Hymenoptera have been described, in addition to over 2,000 extinct ones. Females typically have a special ovipositor for inserting eggs into hosts or places that are otherwise inaccessible. The ovipositor is often modified into a stinger. The young develop through holometabolism. That is, they have a worm-like larval stage and an inactive pupal stage before they mature, as it makes sisters exceptionally closely related to each other. However, the majority of wasp species are solitary, with each adult female living and breeding independently. Females typically have an ovipositor for laying eggs in or near a food source for the larvae, though in the acula the ovipositor is often modified instead into a sting used for defense or prey capture. Wasps play many ecological roles. Some are predators or pollinators, whether to feed themselves or to provision their nests. Many, notably the cuckoo wasps, are kleptoparasites, laying eggs in the nests of other wasps. Many of the solitary wasps are parasitoidal, meaning they lay eggs on or in other insects, any life stage from egg to adult, and often provision their own nests with such hosts. Unlike true parasites, the wasp larvae eventually kill their hosts. Solitary wasps parasitize almost every pest insect, making wasps invaluable in horticulture for biological pest control of species such as whitefly in tomatoes and other crops. Wasps first appeared in the fossil record in the Jurassic and diversified into many surviving superfamilies by the Cretaceous. They are a successful and diverse group of insects with tens of thousands of described species. Wasps has spreads to all parts of the world except for the polar regions. The largest social wasp is the Asian giant hornet, at up to 5 centimeters in length. Among the largest solitary wasps is a group of species known as tarantula hawks, along with the giant scalid of Indonesia. The smallest wasps are solitary chalkid wasps in the family Mammaridae, including the world's smallest known insect, with a body length of only 0.139 millimeters, and the smallest known flying insect, only 0.15 millimeters long. In his book, The Creating, E.O. Wilson outlines the devastating impact on the environment if all insects were to vanish. Firstly, a majority of flowering plants fail to reproduce. Most herbaceous plants die out. The great majority of birds and mammals, reptiles and amphibians, denied their fruits, foliage, and insect prey, follow plants into oblivion. Soil remains unturned by insects, accelerating plant decline. Populations of fungi and bacteria explode, feeding on the dead and rotting vegetation. Wind pollinated grasses and fern and conifer species would spread over much of the deforested terrain. Humans survive, able to eat wind pollinated grains and marine fish, but there is widespread starvation and wars for control of dwindling resources, while human populations plunge to a small fraction of their former level.